About 14 years ago, I left a Big Four audit firm where I'd worked as a manager and later a senior manager. My specialty was helping businesses of all sizes claim lucrative Canadian tax incentives for research and development. When I left, Silicon Valley's startup ecosystem was starting to get into full swing. Since then, I've worked extensively with startups looking to defy the odds and become what private equity firms lovingly refer to as unicorns. In case you wondered, unicorns don't exist, except maybe in Scotland, where the unicorn is their national animal. In spite of this, I have worked with at least one or two that made it. Back in 2008, the world was suffering through a financial crisis, and central banks in modern Western economies responded by reducing interest rates to almost zero, in some cases even less than zero. The rise of private equity and the mythologies around startup culture began to accelerate in that very low interest rate environment. Angel investors and private equity began investing small amounts in herds of technology startups. As long as interest rates were at historic lows, they could afford to sit back and wait for the eventual winners to emerge. They needed very high internal rates of return to make things work. In 2007, just before the crisis, Tech Coast Angels in California were looking for an internal return of in excess of 50% to meet their targets. By contrast, historically, a reasonable benchmark for long-term average stock market returns has been about 7% to 10% per year. After the 2008 financial crisis, venture capitalists could do a lot more with less. It wasn't long before I started to think that sea turtle hatchlings were a pretty good metaphor for Silicon Valley tech startups. The odds they face when making their first desperate dash to the relative safety of the ocean are steep. And the odds aren't any better for startups than they are for turtle hatchlings. Only about 6% of startups looking for private investment get any kind of funding at all. Of those, only 0.5% make it as unicorns. Those are pretty long odds, about 3 in 10,000, which are about the same odds as a sea turtle has of reaching adulthood. According to a study by Industry Canada, the survival rates for small businesses in Canada are as follows. After 1 year, about 85% of small businesses still remain. After 2, about 70%. And after 5 years, there's still around 51% of them kicking around. Now, we could read the tea leaves and try to find out what causes many small businesses to fail. Maybe that's even a good idea. But in case you missed it, the survival stats for ordinary small businesses are orders of magnitude better than they are for tech startups. At the Hatchery, our goal is to help startups, particularly technology startups, to survive long enough to reach the relative safety of the ocean. To survive, sea turtle hatchlings must avoid predators and move as quickly as possible toward the ocean. For startups, many predators wear business suits and offer introductions to networks of qualified investors in exchange for consulting services. Most of these have been influenced by David Maister's trusted business advisor and managing the professional services firm. In our view, one key strategy is to battle test your product or service offering to make sure that it meets the needs of your customers. You must do this before you start that mad dash to reach the ocean, metaphorically speaking. In other words, deciding to take on private equity should wait until your minimum viable product has shown itself to be actually viable. While you're doing this, keep your costs down by avoiding expensive professional consultants and using non-dilutive funding like Canada's generous SHRED program for experimental development.